I hope to have provided here. I have been speculating in currencies ever since they started floating, but I have failed to make money on a consistent basis. On balance, I traded profitably through 1980, then chalked up losses between 1981 and 1985. My approach has been tentative, based more on intuition than on conviction. By temperament, I have always been more interested in picking the turning point than in following a trend. I managed to catch both the rise and fall of European currencies against the dollar until 1981, but I traded myself out of my positions too soon. Having lost the trend, I found it too demeaning to start following the trend followers. I tried to pick the reversal point instead, needless to say, without success. I had some temporary profits in the early part of 1984, but I gave them all back. I was again engaged in a speculation against the dollar at the time I wrote this chapter. Writing it has undoubtedly helped to clarify my thoughts. Admittedly, the theory is far too abstract to be of much use in making concrete predictions. Specifically, the turning point cannot be determined until it has actually occurred. But as we shall see, the theory can be very useful in interpreting events as they unfold. The credit and regulatory cycle. There seems to be a special affinity between reflexivity and credit. That is hardly surprising. Credit depends on expectations. Expectations involve bias. Hence, credit is one of the main avenues that permit bias to play a causal role in the course of events. But there is more to it. Credit seems to be associated with a particular kind of reflexive pattern that is known as boom and bust. The pattern is asymmetrical. The boom is drawn out and accelerates gradually. The bust is sudden and often catastrophic. By contrast, when credit is not an essential ingredient in a reflexive process, the pattern tends to be more symmetrical. For instance, in the currency market, it does not seem to make much difference whether the dollar is rising or falling. The exchange rate seems to follow a wave-like pattern. I believe the asymmetry rises out of a reflexive connection between loan and collateral. In this context, I give collateral a very broad definition. It will denote whatever determines the creditworthiness of a debtor, whether it is actually pledged or not. It may mean a piece of property or an expected future stream of income. In either case, it is something on which the lender is willing to place a value. Valuation is supposed to be a passive relationship in which the value reflects the underlying asset. But in this case, it involves a positive act. A loan is made. The act of lending may affect the collateral value. That is the connection that gives rise to a reflexive process. It will be recalled that we have analyzed reflexivity as two connections working in opposite directions. The normal connection, where a value is placed on future events, as in the stock market or banking. We have called it the cognitive function. And a perverse connection, in which expectations affect that which is expected. We have called it the participating function. The participating function is perverse because its effect is not always felt, and when it does operate, its influence is so difficult to disentangle that it tends to go unrecognized. The prevailing view of how financial markets operate tends to leave the participating function out of account. For instance, In the international lending boom, bankers did not recognize that the debt ratios of borrowing countries were favorably influenced by their own lending activity. In the conglomerate boom, investors did not realize that per-share earnings growth can be affected by the valuation they place on it. At present, most people do not realize that the erosion of collateral values can depress the economy. The act of lending usually stimulates economic activity. It enables the borrower to consume more than he would otherwise, or invest in productive assets. There are exceptions, to be sure. If the assets in question are not physical but financial ones, the effect is not necessarily stimulative. By the same token, debt service has a depressing impact. Resources that would otherwise be devoted to consumption or the creation of a future stream of income are withdrawn. As the total amount of debt outstanding accumulates, the portion that has to be utilized for debt service increases. It is only net new lending that stimulates, and total new lending has to keep rising in order to keep net new lending stable. The connection between lending and economic activity is far from straightforward. That is, in fact, the best justification for the monetarist's preoccupation with money supply to the neglect of credit. The major difficulty is that credit need not be involved in the physical production or consumption of goods and services. It may be used for purely financial purposes. In this case, its influence on economic activity becomes problematic. For purposes of this discussion, it may be helpful to distinguish between a real economy and a financial economy. Economic activity takes place in the real economy, while the extension and repayment of credit occur in the financial economy. The reflexive interaction between the act of lending and the value of the collateral may then connect the real and the financial economy, or it may be confined to the financial economy. Here we shall focus on the first case. A strong economy tends to enhance the asset values and income streams that serve to determine creditworthiness. In the early stages of a reflexive process of credit expansion, the amount of credit involved is relatively small, so that its impact on collateral values is negligible. That is why the expansionary phase is slow to start with, and credit remains soundly based at first. But as the amount of debt accumulates, total lending increases in importance and begins to have an appreciable effect on collateral values. The process continues until a point is reached where total credit cannot increase fast enough to continue stimulating the economy. By that time, collateral values have become greatly dependent on the stimulative effect of new lending, and as new lending fails to accelerate, collateral values begin to decline. The erosion of collateral values has a depressing effect on economic activity, which in turn reinforces the erosion of collateral values. Since the collateral has been pretty fully utilized at that point, a decline may precipitate the liquidation of loans, which in turn makes the decline more precipitous. That is the anatomy of a typical boom and bust. Booms and busts are not symmetrical because, at the inception of a boom, both the volume of credit and the value of the collateral are at a minimum. At the time of the bust, both are at a maximum. But there is another factor at play. The liquidation of loans takes time. The faster it has to be accomplished, the greater the effect on the value of the collateral. In a bust, the reflexive interaction between loans and collateral becomes compressed within a very short time frame, and the consequences can be catastrophic. It is the sudden liquidation of accumulated positions that gives a bust such a different shape from the preceding boom. It can be seen that the boom-bust sequence is a particular variant of reflexivity. Booms can arise whenever there is a two-way connection between values and the act of valuation. The act of valuation takes many forms. In the stock market, it is equity that is valued. In banking, it is collateral. It is possible, although unlikely, that a boom could be generated without any credit expansion. The two examples we studied in the stock market, the REIT and conglomerate booms, could, in theory, have unfolded without the stocks being used as collateral, although in practice there was a lot of credit involved. In the absence of credit, the reversal would be a more gradual process. The contraction would not be a mirror image of the expansion for the reason mentioned earlier. The reflexive element in valuations is greater at the time of reversal than at the inception of a trend. But the compression that is characteristic of busts would be absent. Both the boom-bust pattern and its explanation are almost too obvious to be interesting. The amazing thing is that the reflexive connection between lending and collateral has not been generally recognized. There is an enormous literature on the trade cycle, but I have not seen much awareness of the reflexive relationship described here. Moreover, the trade cycles that are generally discussed in textbooks differ in duration from the credit cycle I am discussing here. They are short-term fluctuations within a larger pattern. There is an awareness of a larger cycle, usually referred to as the Kondratiev wave, but it has never been scientifically explained. At present, there is much concern that we may be approaching another recession, but the general assumption is that we are dealing with a recession just like any other. The fact that we are in the declining phase of the larger cycle is usually left out of account. I contend that all previous recessions since the end of World War II occurred while credit was expanding, while the one we may or may not be facing now would occur when borrowing capacity in the real economy is contracting. This creates a situation that has no precedent in recent history. Exactly where we are in the larger cycle is difficult to determine. I must confess I have been confused on the issue since 1982. The reason for my confusion is that while the boom has clearly run out of steam, the bust has not taken place. Busts can be very disruptive, especially if the liquidation of collateral causes a sudden compression of credit. The consequences are so unpleasant that strenuous efforts are made to avoid them. The institution of central banking has evolved in a continuing attempt to prevent sudden, catastrophic contractions in credit. Since a panic is hard to arrest once it has started, prevention is best practiced in the expansionary phase. That is why the role of central banks has gradually expanded to include the regulation of the money supply. That is also why organized financial markets regulate the ratio of collateral to credit. Until now, the authorities have been able to prevent a bust. We find ourselves in a twilight zone where the normal process of credit expansion culminated long ago, but the normal process of credit contraction has been prevented by the authorities. We are in uncharted territory because the actions of the authorities have no precedent. The fact that banks and organized financial markets are regulated complicates the course of events tremendously. Financial history is best interpreted as a reflexive process in which there are two sets of participants instead of one, competitors and regulators. Such a system is much more complex than the case we studied in the stock market. There, the regulatory environment was more or less fixed. It was the backdrop against which the drama was acted out. Here, the regulatory environment is an integral part of the process. It is important to realize that the regulators are also participants. There is a natural tendency to regard them as superhuman beings who somehow stand outside and above the economic process and intervene only when the participants have made a mess of it. That is not the case. They also are human, all too human. They operate with imperfect understanding, and their activities have unintended consequences. Indeed, they seem to adjust to changing circumstances less well than those who are motivated by profit and loss, so that regulations are generally designed to prevent the last mishap, not the next one. The deficiencies of regulation tend to be more noticeable when conditions are rapidly changing, and conditions tend to change more rapidly when the economy is less regulated. We begin to discern a reflexive relationship between the regulators and the economy they regulate. It gives rise to a process that takes place concurrently with the process of credit expansion and contraction, and interacts with it. It is no wonder that the result is so complex and perplexing. The regulatory cycle does not have the asymmetric character of the credit cycle. It seems to fit the wave pattern we developed for the currency market better than the boom and bust pattern of the credit cycle. Just as freely floating currencies tend to fluctuate between over and undervaluation, so market economies tend to fluctuate between over and under regulation. The length of the cycle seems to be correlated with the credit cycle, and one can sense intuitively why that should be so. Credit expansion and contraction have much to do with changes in the economy, which in turn have a bearing on the adequacy of regulations. Conversely, the regulatory environment influences not only how fast credit can expand, but also how far. Clearly, there is a two-way connection between credit and regulation, but it is far from clear to me at this stage of the investigation what pattern, if any, the interaction follows. That is the main source of my confusion. We have identified a credit cycle that follows a boom-bust pattern, a regulatory cycle that is more wave-like, and an interplay between the two whose pattern is unclear. There are, of course, many secular developments involved as well, some of which relate to credit, some to regulation, and some to both. We have mentioned that central banks tend to get stronger after each crisis. That is a secular development that renders each cycle unique. In the Great Depression, both the banking system and the international trading system collapsed, making the contraction of credit and economic activity much more severe than it would have been otherwise. We can be certain that every effort will be made to avoid a similar collapse in this cycle. We did not dwell on the information revolution or on the improvements in transportation that have helped the development of an integrated world economy. The outcome of all these influences is a unique course of events that is easier to explain than to predict. Looked at from this perspective, the entire post-war period is part of a large expansionary boom that is now well advanced and ripe for a bust. The bust has been avoided, however, by the intervention of the authorities at crucial moments. The same post-war period has also seen an almost complete swing from government regulation to unrestrained competition. We are now at a curious moment where the bias in favor of deregulation is still on the rise, yet the need for government intervention in specific areas is beginning to reassert itself. The banking industry, for one, is already on the way to becoming more regulated. One could try and write a history of the post-war era in these terms. The present credit cycle started after the end of World War II. The origins of the regulatory cycle go back even farther to the New Deal, although the creation of the Bretton Woods system can be taken as the starting point as far as the world economy is concerned. The expansion that followed was intimately related to the removal of restrictions on international trade and investment. But international capital movements created problems for the Bretton Woods system that were never anticipated and remain unresolved. I shall not attempt to present the complete story here. I shall start at the point where I became actively involved, and I shall follow the path of my own involvement. This will give the investigation a more experimental character. My experience began after the breakdown of the system of fixed exchange rates in 1973. Relationships that had been fixed became subject to reflexive influences, and my interest veered from specific companies and industries to macroeconomic processes. My study of growth banks in 1972 constituted a transition point, although I did not know it at the time. With the passage of time, I found the instability of macroeconomic trends increasingly disturbing in both a subjective and an objective sense, and I decided to distance myself from active investing in 1981. After the crisis of 1982, I made a theoretical study of the international debt problem. I was under the mistaken impression that the crisis of 1982 constituted the climax in the process of credit expansion. I thought that the authorities were not doing enough to prevent a bust. I failed to realize that they were doing too much. They actually kept credit expanding, albeit on a more unsound basis than ever. The United States replaced less developed countries as the borrower of last resort, and commercial banks tried to grow their way out of the loans made to less developed countries by aggressively expanding in other directions. This led to another series of crises in 1984 that constituted the real turning point for the banking and thrift industries. We are now suffering from the after effects of that climax. The United States government continues to borrow on an ever-increasing scale, but here too a turning point is at hand. The dollar has begun to decline, and foreigners are going to be repaid in a depreciating currency. Perhaps the last great engine of credit creation that is still going full blast is in the stock market, where merger mania is at its peak, but it does not have a stimulating effect on the real economy. The theoretical framework of an interrelated credit and regulatory cycle became somewhat clearer to me in the course of writing this book, although I cannot claim that the process of clarification is complete. The scope for financial alchemy, an evaluation of the experiment. In evaluating my approach, we must distinguish between its ability to produce profits in financial markets and its ability to predict the future course of events. The fact that the distinction is necessary has far-reaching implications. My financial success stands in stark contrast with my ability to forecast events. In this context, we must distinguish between events in financial markets and events in the real world. Events in financial markets determine financial success. Events in the real world are relevant only in evaluating the scientific merit of my approach. Even in predicting financial markets, my record is less than impressive. The best that can be said for it is that my theoretical framework enables me to understand the significance of events as they unfold, although the record is less than spotless. One would expect a successful method to yield firm predictions. But all my forecasts are extremely tentative and subject to constant revision in the light of market developments. Occasionally I develop some conviction, and when I do, the payoff can be substantial. But even then, there is an ever-present danger that the course of events fails to correspond to my expectations. My approach works not by making valid predictions, but by allowing me to correct false ones. With regard to events in the real world, my record is downright dismal. The outstanding feature of my predictions is that I keep on expecting developments that do not materialize. How can financial success and predictive failure be reconciled? That is the question I shall address in this chapter. But before I do so, I must remind the reader why it arises in the first place. My decision-making process was greatly influenced by personal factors, such as my presence or absence from the office. The fact that the monetary results served as a possible criterion of the validity of my ideas made me try harder than I would have otherwise. This is borne out by the fact that my understanding was much hazier and my moves in the market more tentative during the control period than they were at the height of the experiment. Such haziness is quite common. It is the sharp focus that I managed to attain in the course of the experiment that is rather exceptional. I was greatly helped by the discipline of having to write down my thoughts. My arguments may not strike the reader as particularly well organized, but they are certainly more consistent than they would have been if I had not taken the trouble to formulate them in writing. I was also inspired by the fact that I was able to combine the two great abiding interests in my life: philosophical speculation and speculation in financial markets. Both seemed to benefit from the combination. Together they engaged me more than either one on its own. The other consideration has to do with external events. For instance, I recall the time, in 1981 to 82, when the Federal Reserve sought to control the quantity of money and allowed market forces to set interest rates. The market for government bonds, and to a lesser extent for stocks and currencies, became like a casino, and my approach of formulating hypotheses and testing them against the market became worse than useless. By the time I recognized a market trend and formulated a hypothesis to explain it, the trend had already changed, and I had to find a new hypothesis. The result was that I was always lagging behind the market and kept on getting whipsawed until I abandoned the hopeless struggle and delegated the task of gambling in government bond futures to someone more qualified. I found a computer-based speculator, Victor Niederhofer, who had developed a system using the assumption that the market is a casino. He operated successfully until the international debt crisis of 1982 changed the nature of the game. He had the rare fortitude to close the account before he had lost all the money he had made for me previously. I could argue that an approach which allows me to recognize when it does not work is a valid approach. Still, it is somehow more convincing to demonstrate it at a juncture when it does work. These two considerations go a long way toward explaining my financial success. I have never claimed scientific status for my theoretical framework. On the contrary, I have argued that reflexive processes cannot be predicted by scientific method, and the real-time experiment was a deliberate attempt to explore an alternative method. To bring the point home, I have described the alternative method as alchemy. Scientific method seeks to understand things as they are, while alchemy seeks to bring about a desired state of affairs. To put it another way, the primary objective of science is the truth, that of alchemy, operational success. In the sphere of natural phenomena, there is no distinction between the two objectives. Nature obeys laws that operate independently of whether they are understood or not. The only way man can bend nature to his will is by understanding and applying these laws. That is why alchemy has failed and natural science reigns supreme. But social phenomena are different. They have thinking participants. Events do not obey laws that operate independently of what anybody thinks. On the contrary, the participants' thinking is an integral part of the subject matter. This creates an opening for alchemy that was absent in the sphere of natural science. Operational success can be achieved without attaining scientific knowledge. By the same token, scientific method is rendered just as ineffectual in dealing with social events as alchemy was in altering the character of natural substances. My approach is more successful in dealing with financial markets than with the real world. The reason for it readily suggests itself. Financial markets themselves function imperfectly as a mechanism for predicting events in the real world. There is always a divergence between prevailing expectations and the actual course of events. Financial success depends on the ability to anticipate prevailing expectations and not real-world developments. But as we have seen, my approach rarely produces firm predictions, even about the future course of financial markets. It is only a framework for understanding the course of events as they unfold. If it has any validity, it is because the theoretical framework corresponds to the way that financial markets operate. That means that the markets themselves can be viewed as formulating hypotheses about the future and then submitting them to the test of the actual course of events. The hypotheses that survive the test are reinforced. Those that fail are discarded. The main difference between me and the markets is that markets seem to engage in a process of trial and error without the participants fully understanding what is going on, while I do it consciously. Presumably, that is why I can do better than the market. If this view is correct, financial markets bear a curious resemblance to scientific method. Both involve the testing of hypotheses. But there is a fundamental difference. In science, testing serves to establish the truth. In financial markets, the criterion is operational success. In contradistinction with natural science, the two criteria do not coincide. How could they? Market prices always express a prevailing bias, whereas natural science works with an objective criterion. Scientific theories are judged by the facts. Financial decisions are judged by the distorted views of the participants. Instead of scientific method, financial markets embody the method of alchemy. This interpretation of financial markets as a mechanism for testing hypotheses by alchemy is both novel and challenging. The fact that it is not generally accepted adds to the challenge. How can markets be testing something when the participants don't know what they are doing? The answer is to be found in the results they achieve. Try to propound an unformulated hypothesis and you get a hit-or-miss result. By contrast, when you deliberately formulate your hypotheses, you can consistently outperform the market averages, provided your specific predictions are not too far off the mark. Treating the market as a mechanism for testing hypotheses seems to be an effective hypothesis. It produces results that are better than a random walk. This conclusion validates the approach I have taken over a strictly scientific one. If we abide by the methods of natural science, we arrive at the random walk theory. The hypotheses that are being tested have to be disregarded because they do not constitute facts, and what we are left with is a jumble of haphazard price fluctuations. On the other hand, if we look at the situation from the inside, from the vantage point of a participant, we discover a process of trial and error. It is not easy to make sense of the process. Many people participate only with a vague idea of what is going on, and I must confess that the sensation of being on a random walk is not unfamiliar to me. My attempts at formulating conjectures about the future work only intermittently. Oftentimes all I get is white noise. But when I succeed in formulating a worthwhile conjecture, the results can be very rewarding. Markets provide the criterion by which investment decisions are judged. Moreover, they play a causal role in shaping the course of events. The information is more readily available than events in the real world. Hence, the market action offers the most convenient feedback mechanism by which one's expectations can be evaluated. One need not regard the market as always right in order to use it in that capacity. Indeed, if one believes that the market is always right, there is little to be gained from having a feedback mechanism, because the prospect of outperforming the market becomes a matter of pure chance. The contention of classical economic theory that the market mechanism assures the optimum allocation of resources is false. Its true merit is that it provides a criterion by which the participants can recognize their own misconceptions. But it is important to realize what kind of criterion the market provides. Far from being always right, it always incorporates the prevailing bias. If participants labor under the misapprehension that the market is always right, the feedback they get is misleading. Indeed, the belief in efficient markets renders markets more unstable by short-circuiting the corrective process that would occur if participants recognized that markets are always biased. The more the theory of efficient markets is believed, the less efficient the markets become. How good are financial markets in predicting real-world developments? Reading the record, it is striking how many calamities that I anticipated did not in fact materialize. The financial markets must have come to reflect the same concerns. Otherwise, my false expectations could not have proven so rewarding. This raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps some of the developments I predicted were preempted by the very fact that they were anticipated by the market, and the market provoked a reaction that prevented them from happening. This seems to hold true of the collapse of the banking system and of the collapse of the dollar, and also of the bull market of our lifetime, which was to be followed by a crash, 1929 style. The monetary authorities became so concerned about the excessive buoyancy of financial markets that in the end they refused to supply the excess liquidity that would create a speculative bubble. Their action was neither deliberate nor unanimous. In the U.S., Volcker was opposed to providing excess liquidity, but he was defeated in the Open Market Committee and had to appeal to Germany to join in a round of interest rate reductions. When Secretary Baker pushed for another round, the Germans balked, and the resulting row almost wrecked the Group of Five process. The Japanese devised their own medicine, but by the time it took effect, the speculative bubble was sufficiently developed to precipitate a more or less full-scale bust in the Japanese stock market. No wonder I had difficulty in recognizing the premature demise of the bull market of a lifetime. It is possible that the United States will continue to create excess liquidity, but I consider it unlikely that it will cause a speculative bubble. because the confidence has been too badly shaken. It is more likely that investors would flee to liquidity and gold. When I finally recognized that markets can preempt the catastrophes they predict, I concluded that we live in an age of self-defeating prophecies. The collapse of oil prices does not seem to fit the argument because it actually occurred, but that may be attributed to the fact that either I or the authorities have misjudged its dire consequences. I expected such severe repercussions on the banking system and on the economy as to make a levy on imported oil indispensable, while we seem to have gotten along fine without it. In the end, it was left to OPEC to pull itself together. The present arrangement is no more permanent than the Group of Five process. The drama has yet to be played out in both cases. This line of argument opens up a fascinating vista. I may have discovered not just a reasonably effective way of operating in financial markets, but an actual model of how the financial markets operate in the real world. Models currently in use are based on the misconception that markets can only foreshadow events, they cannot shape them. My approach recognizes that financial markets can also precipitate or abort future events. Following this line of argument, it is possible that we have indeed been teetering on the verge of both a deflationary spiral and a free fall of the dollar, not to mention all sorts of other financial calamities, and we have been saved from them only because of the danger signals emitted by the financial markets. In other words, financial markets constantly anticipate events, both on the positive and on the negative side, which fail to materialize exactly because they have been anticipated. No wonder that financial markets get so excited in anticipating events that seem quite harmless in retrospect. It is an old joke that the stock market has predicted 7 of the last 2 recessions. We can now understand why that should be so. By the same token, financial crashes tend to occur only when they are unexpected. This last point should not be overstated. There are many events that actually occur in spite of the fact that they were widely anticipated. The collapse in oil prices is a case in point. The outbreak of the Second World War was another. It has become fashionable to be a contrarian, but to bet against prevailing expectations is far from safe. It will be recalled that in the boom-bust model, events tend to reinforce prevailing expectations most of the time and contradict them only at the inflection points. And inflection points are notoriously difficult to identify. Now that the contrarian viewpoint has become the prevailing bias, I have become a confirmed anti-contrarian. Free markets versus regulation. It is almost redundant to criticize the concept of equilibrium any further. In the first chapter, I asserted that the concept is a hypothetical one, whose relevance to the real world is open to question. In subsequent chapters, I examined various financial markets as well as macroeconomic developments and showed that they exhibit no tendency towards equilibrium. Indeed, it makes more sense to claim that markets tend toward excesses, which sooner or later become unstable so that they are eventually corrected. Equilibrium is supposed to ensure the optimum allocation of resources. If markets do not tend towards equilibrium, the main argument that has been used in favor of the market mechanism loses its validity. We have no grounds for believing that markets optimize anything. This may sound like a startling conclusion, but it falls far short of that. The concept of an optimum is just as alien to a world in which participants function without the benefit of perfect knowledge as the concept of an equilibrium, and for the same reason. Both concepts presuppose perfect knowledge, so it is not at all surprising if both of them are shown to have little relevance to the real world. There are other arguments that can be advanced in favor of the market mechanism. I interpreted financial markets as a process that is somewhat akin to scientific method. That is to say, a process of trial and error in which the market price at the termination of the experiment serves as a criterion by which the experiment can be judged. The criterion does not meet the requirements of scientific method, because the market price is not independent of the participants' decisions, in the way in which the events studied by natural scientists are independent of the statements that scientists make about them. Nevertheless, it is a useful criterion because it is just as real and just as amenable to scientific observation as any natural phenomenon. Moreover, it is of vital interest to market participants. Thus, the market mechanism has the merit of providing an objective criterion, albeit a biased one. How great that merit is we can appreciate only when we consider what happens in its absence. For that purpose, we must look at centrally planned economies which, in revulsion against the deficiencies of market economies, have eschewed the use of the pricing mechanism. Output has to be measured in physical quantities, and the distortions are far worse than the excesses of the market. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. The same can be said about the market mechanism. It is the worst system of allocating resources except for all the others. Indeed, there are significant similarities between the election mechanism and the market mechanism. It would be difficult to argue that elections optimize the political leadership of a country. The skills needed to attract votes bear little relevance to the qualities a candidate is going to need once he is in office. Nevertheless, the very fact that he has to run for election imposes a discipline which helps prevent some of the more egregious excesses. The value of an objective criterion is perhaps best appreciated subjectively. We all live in a fantasy world. Having an affinity for abstract ideas, I am perhaps more apt to be carried away into a world of my own creation than many other people. The markets have always helped to preserve my sense of reality. It may seem paradoxical that my sense of reality should be rooted in the markets when markets often behave so strangely that they strike other onlookers as unreal. Yet as a market participant I am not merely aware of being connected to reality, I actually feel it in my guts. I react to events in the marketplace as an animal reacts to events in the jungle. For instance, I used to be able to anticipate an impending disaster because it manifested itself in the form of a backache. I was, of course, unable to tell what shape the disaster would take. By the time I could identify it, my backache would dissolve. There was a time when my involvement with the market was all-embracing, much to the detriment of my relationships with human beings. Now that I have managed to distance myself, my market sense has suffered. Events often reach me as white noise. I cannot make sense of them. For instance, during the real-time experiment, market developments had sharp contours. During the control period, the outlines became more blurred. It is interesting to observe how my market involvement relates to my ability to organize abstract ideas. One would think that being active in the market would interfere with writing, but the opposite seems to be the case. The discipline of having to make investment decisions prevents me from getting too far divorced from reality. During the 3 years that I was writing The Burden of Consciousness, I lost my ability to make money in the stock market, and eventually I got lost in my own abstractions. Again, during the 3 years when I was trying to make sense of the international high pitch. I mention this because it may have more than subjective relevance. Had I been an academic, I could have persisted with my analysis of the debt problem, and if reality failed to conform to my expectations, I could have defended my analysis by blaming extraneous developments. Eventually, some of my expectations were fulfilled, albeit with a delay of several years. As a market-oriented man, I found such a delay intolerable, and I felt obliged to search for and to recognize the flaws in my argument. As an academic, I could have claimed to be vindicated. The point I am trying to make is that the market is a harder taskmaster than academic debate. Yet it is easy to exaggerate the merits of having an objective criterion at our disposal. We have become so fixated on objective criteria that we are inclined to endow them with a value they do not intrinsically possess. Profit, the bottom line, efficiency, takes on the aspect of an end in itself instead of being a means to an end. We tend to measure every activity by the amount of money it brings. Artists are valued according to the price their products sell for. What is worse, we often want to make a profit from activities that ought to be otherwise motivated. Politicians want to earn lecture fees and sell their memoirs. White House aides become lobbyists. Generals in charge of procurement angle for lucrative jobs in industry, and so do lawyers working for regulatory agencies. The profit motive has become so all-embracing that we find it hard to accept when someone is motivated by considerations other than profit. Values that motivate people cannot be readily translated into objective terms, and exactly because individual values are so confusing, we have elevated profit and material wealth, which can be readily measured in terms of money, into some kind of supreme value. Surely that is an exaggeration. The fact is that in a world of imperfect understanding, there is some kind of exaggeration or bias involved in every value. In our civilization, the value of profit is exaggerated, and so is the value of objectivity. Let us take a closer look at the kind of criterion market prices provide. The distinction we have drawn between scientific method and alchemy will come in useful. I have argued that in the study of social phenomena we need to distinguish between two kinds of validity, one associated with truth, the other with effectiveness. In natural science, the distinction is missing. Theories are effective only if they are true. That is why alchemy does not work. Following this line of thought, we can argue that the market price provides a criterion of effectiveness, but not a criterion of truth. Future market prices will determine how the various participants fare, but they will not determine whether their understanding is correct. Only if market prices tend towards an equilibrium would the two criteria merge. The market price would then be the correct price. We can see now how important the concept of equilibrium is. It serves as a bridge between natural and social science, and eliminates the disturbing dichotomy between truth and effectiveness that characterizes the study of social phenomena. Unfortunately, the bridge does not stand up because imperfect understanding renders the concept of equilibrium inappropriate. Without an innate tendency towards equilibrium, the course of events cannot be determined by scientific method, but it can be shaped by the methods of alchemy. The attempt to transpose the methods and criteria of natural science to the social sphere is unsustainable. It gives rise to inflated expectations that cannot be fulfilled. These expectations go far beyond the immediate issue of scientific knowledge and color our entire way of thinking. The belief that economic policy ought to aim at the optimum allocation of resources has dominated political thought and political action since the middle of the 19th century. Those on the left wanted the state to take charge of the allocation. Those on the right wanted to leave it to the market mechanism. Under the influence of Marxism, the pursuit of the optimum led to the total abandonment of the market mechanism in large parts of the world. Even in market-oriented economies, the state was given a large role in correcting the imperfections of the market mechanism. Gradually, the harmful side effects of state intervention have become increasingly evident, and the prevailing bias has swung back in favor of free markets. We are quite willing to recognize the fallacy in Marxism, but we are much less inclined to admit that the theory of perfect competition is imbued with a similar fallacy. Both are built on the assumption of perfect knowledge. In one case, the assumption produces market equilibrium. In the other, it finds expression in an unconditional prediction of the course of history. It is worth pointing out that both theories originated in the 19th century, when the limitations of knowledge were not yet recognized and science reigned supreme. Once we recognize that the optimum is unattainable, we are in a better position to evaluate the merits and shortcomings of the market mechanism. I do not want to get involved in the problems connected with the distribution of wealth, not because I do not consider them important, but only because my analysis has little to contribute to the subject. I want to focus on one particular weakness of the market mechanism: its innate instability. Its cause has been identified. It derives from the two-way connection between thinking and reality that I have labeled reflexivity. It is not in operation in all markets at all times, but if and when it occurs, there is no limit to how far away both perceptions and events can move from anything that could be considered equilibrium. Instability is not necessarily harmful. Indeed, if it were described as dynamic adjustment, it would sound positively benign. But carried to extremes, it can give rise to sudden reversals that may take on catastrophic proportions. That is particularly the case where credit is involved, because the liquidation of collateral can lead to sudden compression of market prices. The prevention of excessive instability is therefore a necessary condition for the smooth functioning of the market mechanism. It is not a condition that the market mechanism can ensure on its own. On the contrary, I have presented evidence that unregulated financial markets tend to become progressively more unstable. The evidence is most clear-cut in the currency markets, but it is also quite persuasive with regard to the expansion and contraction of credit. Whether stock markets would prove inherently unstable if there were no credit involved remains an open question, because stock market booms are always associated with credit expansion. Excessive instability can be prevented only by some sort of regulation. How much instability is excessive is a matter of judgment. Standards vary with time. The degree of dislocation we are willing to tolerate today, as measured by unemployment figures, would have seemed inconceivable a few decades ago when the memories of the Great Depression were still fresh and the drawbacks of full employment policies less evident. Similarly, the restrictions on corporate restructuring have been greatly relaxed between the conglomerate boom of the 1960s and the merger mania of the 1980s. The trouble with regulation is that the regulators are also human and apt to err. In order to avoid arbitrary behavior and abuse of power, rules and regulations need to be fixed in advance, and it is difficult to devise regulations that are flexible enough to meet all contingencies. Regulations tend to be rigid and to hinder innovation. The rigidities and distortions they introduce tend to be just as cumulative as the instability of an unregulated market. Income taxes provide a good example. The steeper the rates and the longer they stay in effect, the more widespread the tax avoidance and the more complex the tax code. I do not want to keep the discussion at such a high level of generality much longer, because it can easily deteriorate into empty phrases. I shall try to make some policy suggestions in the next chapter. Here I want to make only one general point. Both regulation and unrestrained competition can be harmful when carried to extremes. But the failure of one extreme is no justification for turning to the other. The two extremes should be treated not as alternatives, but as limits within which the right balance needs to be struck. The task is complicated by our innate tendency to be biased in one direction or the other. In The Burden of Consciousness, written some 25 years ago, I developed a rather elaborate scheme along these lines. I took the rate of change as my critical variable, and I argued that people, with their imperfect understanding, are bound to exaggerate it in one direction or the other. One extreme yields a traditional or a dogmatic mode of thinking, according to which the existing arrangements have to be accepted as they are because it is inconceivable that they should be otherwise. The other extreme produces a critical mode of thinking in which everything is considered possible until disproved. Each mode of thinking is linked with a form of social organization which corresponds to it with the degree of imperfection that is appropriate to the imperfect understanding of the participants. In this way, the traditional mode of thinking is associated with tribal society, the dogmatic mode with totalitarian society, and the critical mode with open society. Needless to say, I was very much under the influence of Karl Popper. I opted for open society, but the choice was not without qualification. Each form of social organization was found wanting in something that could be found only in its opposite. Totalitarian society lacked freedom. Open society lacked stability. But given our innate bias, a stable equilibrium between the two is just as unlikely to be attained as a stable equilibrium in a free market. Sentiment is likely to swing in one direction or the other. After nearly half a century of what now appears as excessive regulation, we have been moving towards excessive deregulation. The sooner we recognize that some kind of regulation is necessary in order to maintain stability, the better our chances of preserving the benefits of a nearly free market system. The paradox of systemic reform. I have provided the outlines not only of a viable international financial system, but also of a viable economic policy for the United States. It is no more than a sketch or a vision, but it could be elaborated to cover other aspects that I have not touched upon here. Two fundamental problems present themselves. One is abstract, and the other is personal. The abstract problem concerns all attempts at systemic reform. Given our inherently imperfect understanding, isn't there a paradox in systemic reform? How can we hope to design an internally consistent system? The personal problem concerns my aversion to bureaucracy. An international central bank would make bureaucracy inescapable. I believe the paradox of systemic reform is spurious, but it needs to be dealt with. Only if one could demand permanent and perfect solutions would it have any validity. But it follows from our imperfect understanding that permanent and perfect solutions are beyond our reach. Life is temporary. Only death is permanent. It makes a great deal of difference how we live our lives. Temporary solutions are much better than none at all. There is a great temptation to insist on a permanent solution. To understand its source, we must consider the meaning of life and death. The fear of death is one of the most deeply felt human emotions. We find the idea of death totally unacceptable, and we grasp at any straw to escape it. The striving for permanence and perfection is just one of the ways in which we seek to escape death. It happens to be a deception. Far from escaping the idea of death, we embrace it. Permanence and perfection are death. I have thought about the meaning of life and death long and hard, and I have come up with a formulation that I have found personally satisfying. I shall sum it up here, although I realize that it may not be as meaningful to others as it is to me. The key is to distinguish between the fact of death and the idea of death. The fact of death is linked with the fact of life, whereas the idea of death stands in juxtaposition with the idea of consciousness. Consciousness and death are irreconcilable, but life and death are not. In other words, the fact of death need not be as terrifying as the idea. The idea of death is overpowering. In terms of death, life and everything connected with it lose all significance. But the idea of death is only an idea, and the correspondence between facts and ideas is less than perfect. It would be a mistake to equate the idea and the fact. As far as facts are concerned, the clear and present fact is that we are alive. Death as a fact looms in the distance, but when we reach it, it will not be the same as the idea we have of it now. In other words, our fear of death is unlikely to be validated by the event. In thinking about life and death, we have a choice. We can take life or death as our starting point. The two are not mutually exclusive. Both need to be dealt with, as a fact and as a thought. But the point of view we adopt tends to favor one or the other. The bias we develop permeates all aspects of our thinking and existence. There are civilizations, like that of the Egyptians, that seem to be devoted to the cult of death. There are others, like that of the Greeks, where even the immortals seem to lead normal lives. In most instances, the 2 points of view are at odds, and the interplay between them makes history. The conflict between the spiritual and the temporal in Christianity is a case in point. The clash of biases can manifest itself in many more subtle ways. Thus, we can take different attitudes with regard to economic regulation. One position is that regulation is useless because it introduces distortions that, left to themselves, eventually lead to a breakdown of the system. This point of view is powerfully reinforced by the argument that the market mechanism, left to itself, tends toward equilibrium. The opposite point of view is that perfection is not attainable either by the market or by regulation. Markets are too unstable, regulation too rigid. Markets need to be regulated, but regulation cannot be left to itself either. It is in constant need of revision. The fact that no system is perfect is not a valid argument against trying to perfect the system. Take Bretton Woods. The fact that it eventually broke down does not alter the fact that it provided the basis for a quarter of a century of prosperity. When it comes to a choice between the two attitudes, mine is clearly in favor of life and the temporary and imperfect structures we can create within it. Although I advocate a comprehensive reform of the financial system, I have no illusions that the new system will be any more flawless or permanent than the preceding ones. On the contrary, I regard the search for permanence and perfection as an illusion. The pitfall in a well-functioning system is that it lulls us into complacency. That is what happened to Bretton Woods, and that is what will happen to the next one if we design it too well. This brings me to the personal problem I have with systemic reform. Systems are operated by bureaucrats, and I have an instinctive aversion to the bureaucratic mentality. In advocating a more regulated international financial system, I seem to be wishing for something that I abhor. The problem is real. The distinctive feature of every bureaucracy is its striving for self-perpetuation. Every system faces the danger that it becomes ossified in the hands of the bureaucracy that administers it. This holds true for Christianity as well as communism. The dead hand of the bureaucracy is difficult to escape. Mao Zedong tried it by instigating the Cultural Revolution, and the consequences were disastrous. But the problem is not insurmountable. When bureaucrats are in charge of a market action serves to keep the bureaucrats on their toes. Experience shows that central banks are among the most flexible, innovative, and efficient institutions. The reason is that the market provides a criterion by which the results of their actions can be judged. They may come under the influence of false ideologies, just like anybody else, but when a policy does not work, they cannot help but notice it. For instance, the Federal Reserve adopted a monetarist stance in 1979, but abandoned it in August 1982. Similarly, the IMF operated with a rather rigid set of prescriptions in dealing with heavily indebted countries, but gradually it has been forced to abandon a formula that does not work. Central banks are often criticized for following the wrong policies, but the very fact that the failures can be demonstrated provides a potent discipline. Moreover, central banks have been surprisingly innovative in handling crises. The Bank of England invented the lifeboat in 1974, and the Federal Reserve applied it on a worldwide scale in the debt crisis of 1982. Volcker, in particular, proved to be a man who thrives on crises. But the fact that a man like Volcker could be at the helm of a central bank cannot be treated as an accident. In sum, the creation of an international central bank does not constitute a permanent solution. Indeed, the very idea that it constitutes a permanent solution carries with it the seeds of the next crisis. Epilogue. The unifying theme of this book is the concept of reflexivity. I have focused on its implications for the social sciences in general and financial markets in particular. I have left other areas largely unexplored. I should like to mention them briefly here, although my thoughts relating to them are not properly developed. They ought to form the subject of another book in the future, but I'm afraid I may not have a chance to write it, especially if I remain involved in financial markets. First, the question of values. Economic theory has trained us to take values as given, although the evidence suggests that they are shaped by a reflexive process. Most values can be reduced to economic terms nowadays. The most recent Nobel laureate in economics earned his prize by interpreting politics as an economic process in which the participants seek to maximize their own benefits. But that has not always been the case, and even today there are many parts of the world where profit-maximizing behavior takes second place to other motivations. Religion and tradition are less easily amenable to economic analysis than is politics in a materialistic culture. We have great difficulty in understanding a phenomenon like Islamic fundamentalism. At the other end of the scale, a movement that we profess to admire, solidarity, is also alien to our way of thinking. The predominance of economic values in Western and westernized societies is itself a function of our economic success. Values evolve in reflexive fashion. The fact that economic activity has borne positive results has enhanced the value we put on economic values. The same can be said about scientific method. The triumphs of natural science have raised the status of scientific method to unsustainable heights. Conversely, various forms of art have played a much bigger role in cultures not very far removed from our own, just because it was easier to achieve positive results in art than in economic activity. Reflexive processes are bound to lead to excesses, but it is impossible to define what is excessive because in matters of values there is no such thing as normal. Perhaps the best way to approach the subject of values is to start from the position that they are rooted in fantasy rather than reality. As a consequence, every set of values has a flaw in it. We can then ask what are the elements of fantasy in a particular set of values and how the elements of fantasy and reality have interacted. Any other approach would introduce a bias in favor of our own flawed set of values. Values are closely associated with the concept of self, a reflexive concept if ever there was one. What we think has a much greater bearing on what we are than on the world around us. What we are cannot possibly correspond to what we think we are, but there is a two-way interplay between the two concepts. As we make our way in the world, our sense of self evolves. The relationship between what we think we are and what we are in reality is the